and today I am going to be talking about 9 women who made history for Gloucester County. These are the 9 ladies right here. So because women's history is not separate from regular history, the way I'm going to go about this discussion is before each woman's story, I'll talk a little bit about what was going on in the world at the time, so we can see the forces that built her and kind of help to better understand then what barriers she broke, what she accomplished as she made history for Gloucester County. And Gloucester County has a very rich women's history, so I've broken it into 3 sections so it's a little more manageable. So the first section will be War and Peace, then some influential women, and then a few women who worked on civil rights for Gloucester, Virginia. Some of these women cross a lot of categories, but we'll just focus on them in categories today because it's a little easier to keep track of. We will start in the early colonial period and work our way up to the 1960s. And lastly, before I start, I want to take a moment to reflect and thank the women who might not have made the history books, but still were a big influence on history and on all of us. So thank you to those women. We are going to start in the Powhatan Confederacy in the early 1600s. So 12,000 years before the English came to Virginia, Virginia Indians lived in an area that Powhatan would call Senecamoka. This area dates to the late Woodland period, which is about 900 to 1600 before Christ, so very, very old. By the 1600s, the Powhatan chiefdom encompassed the entire Tidewater region. A man named Wahan Seneca, also known as Chief Powhatan, became the head chief of the Powhatan Alliance by the early 1600s. He ruled around 32 tribes who would govern independently, but they all paid tribute to Chief Powhatan. The Powhatan chiefdom was matrilineal, meaning that ruling chiefs were descended from a female line rather than male, so think from an aunt rather than a father. Powhatan resided in a town called Werowocomoco, which is in present-day Gloucester. The town was established around 12,000 years before Christ, and it rests on the York River. It was a very political and spiritual site, and is still considered a spiritual site to this day. After the arrival of major European powers like the Spanish and the Americas, the English definitely wanted part of the action. They were dazzled by the ideas of the vast natural resources, all the land, because in England, it was a lot smaller. There was a lot less land to go around. So the Virginia Company of London was formed with the plans to establish a strategic settlement in the New World. This would be established as James Fort. Today it's in the area of Jamestown. It was established as a fort due to its location in Spanish territory. So we might not think of it today, but since the Spanish had technically gotten here first, some of the English were a little concerned that they might be attacked by the Spanish when they arrived rather than the Native Americans who were already here. It was a little bit of an oversight. So it was established as more of a military fort. It became the first permanent English settlement in the United States. And it was also in the territory of the Powhatan people. So the Powhatan people, just like the English at this time, were not unfamiliar with war, and they had their people's safety and their land that they had to consider with the new arrivals. There would be constant clashes between the English and the Powhatan people as the English looked to expand and profit, which was usually at the expense of people who were living here already. The English were kind of a new force and a little unusual, different weapons, different culture, different behaviors. And it was in this meeting of 2 cultures that Pocahontas would rise to notice. So I wanted to start by saying Pocahontas means a lot of different things to different people. We can see there's a really big variety of her portrayals here. We've got Disney Pocahontas, we've got some stuff from the 1920s, Pocahontas Reframed, which is a really great Native American film festival that takes place in Richmond. So Pocahontas was just one of the names that this young woman had. She was Powhatan's daughter, and in accordance with the traditions of her people, she had several different names throughout her life. She had a name from birth, a private name, and her nickname, which was Pocahontas, or playful one. As a child, she grew up in Werowocomoco, so right here in Gloucester, and due to the matrilineal descent that we mentioned earlier, she wouldn't have been considered a princess in the same way that the English interpreted her. But when the English came and they saw that she was the daughter of the chief, they assumed that she was naturally a princess, even though she wouldn't have really inherited that title. Even though women could inherit in that culture, which is really interesting. So in 1607, the year the English arrived at Jamestown, Pocahontas was about 10 or 11. The English said that she was very playful. She liked to do cartwheels in the fort. That's one of the things she was noted for. And here it gets a little difficult. Our sources differ a little bit between English and native accounts. So the English have a very detailed account of Pocahontas' life. It's that she was very interested in the English culture, that she was very enthusiastic about it. But there's also some oral native histories that contradict some of the things there. So I'm just going to talk about the similarities between both accounts. Pocahontas was beloved by her father. She was very curious, very inquisitive, again very playful. They interacted with the English and met John Smith when he arrived. When Pocahontas was old enough to get married, she married a man from the Petawamet tribe named Kocoum. In 1613, there was a great conflict between the English and the Powhatan people, and she was kidnapped by a man named Captain Samuel Argall. She was held captive as a ransom in exchange for the return of weapons and some English prisoners from the Powhatan. During this time, she converted to Christianity, and she took the English name Rebecca. She would also marry a man named John Rolfe, who was a tobacco planter. They had a son, Thomas Rolfe, during this time. This era was known to the English as the Peace of Pocahontas due to lessening fighting between the two powers. Her marriage to John Rolfe kind of made a bit of a peace and a little bit of uniting between the two people. In 1616, Pocahontas, her husband, and a retinue of people from her area would go to the court of King James to represent the Virginia Company. She reunited with John Smith, who she and Powhatan had actually been told was dead. He had had a leg injury and been sent home. The English had told her that he had died. When she met John Smith in England, she actually said she thought she had a hunch he was still alive because his people lied often. So I don't know, but you can see kind of how the conflict was there. Tragically, when she left England, Pocahontas passed away in her early 20s from an unknown illness. She was buried in England, and the Peace of Pocahontas came to an end. So I know we've all heard about Pocahontas and John Smith and the big romance. So that probably didn't happen, but they did have a very strong friendship. They did have a very strong relationship, notwithstanding. John Smith did have that story of her rescuing him. He said she prevented him from having his brains beaten out. It may have been an adoption ceremony that he misinterpreted. We're not really sure what that situation was about. He also did say at one point that a Turkish princess saved his life, so I don't know. But they did have a very close relationship. When she met him in England, again, we talk about how the English considered her as a princess, and John Smith was not a member of the nobility. When she met him in England, she called him father, and he told her that she couldn't do that because she was out of his class system. It was not appropriate for her to call him father. And she responded, "Were you not afraid to come into my father's country and caused fear in him and all of his people, and yet you fear here that I should call you father? I tell you, I will, and you shall call me child, and I will forever be your countryman." So she was spunky. She stood up for things. She was not afraid to talk back. But she's taken on a really mythical space in American culture. We have a few details on her life, but she's been represented since then in several different ways. As a romantic tale, as a heroine on behalf of the English, as a kidnapping victim, and in a lot of advertisements. I didn't get to put many up there, but we do have one from the Jamestown Festival as the quintessential American Indian woman. Her legacy lives on today through her people, her descendants, and the vast amount of pop culture she takes place in. One picture I thought was interesting, I don't know if you can see it, but in the lower right-hand corner, that is a reenactment of her saving John Smith's life, but it is actually put on by the descendants of her people in the early 1900s. I thought that was really neat. Moving on from the colonial period, we will enter the Revolutionary War in the Southern Theater. So in 1781, the American Revolution had been raging for a little over 5 years. It started in 1775 in Massachusetts. In 1776, the U.S. would declare their independence officially. A lot of the early battles of the Revolutionary War took place in northern colonies, but from 1779, major battles in the southern part of the colonies would take place. The Southern campaign began with a wave of British victories, which was probably very discouraging. But in our area, with the siege of Yorktown, we would have the eventual surrender of the British at Yorktown on October 19th, 1781. There were some major players in the Southern Theater. One infamous person was Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton. He was an Englishman who headed troops at several major battles across the southern colonies. In South Carolina, his forces, he's that gentleman in the little circle right there. In South Carolina, his forces would reportedly massacre American troops who were asking for quarter. So he was not appreciated in the U.S. He was loathed as a murderer by the Patriots, but he was pretty much adored by the English as a very dashing young soldier. He was in his late 20s when he was over here doing all of this. And he would be in Gloucester, Virginia in 1781. So while the siege was going on in Yorktown, Gloucester was being occupied by British forces. And Gloucester was a very strategic site to the British because, while they're under siege, Gloucester is a peninsula, so while the British might not be able to access that since the French fleet had come to Yorktown and cut off escape by water, they might be able to escape from Gloucester by land and get more supplies from Gloucester, which was a rural area. So that was something the British didn't want to lose control of during the siege of Yorktown. So by 1781, Tarleton was commanding forces in Gloucester and was conducting raids on farms in the area. But he wasn't the only military presence in Gloucester. American and French forces led by the Duc de Lauzon were also present, and they were looking for Tarleton. And thanks to the help of a Gloucester woman, they found him. So, Elizabeth Sewall Whiting. We don't have any images of her from that time period, just that painting there. The two gentlemen in the corner are Tarleton in green and the Duc de Lauzon, who headed the French forces. So one morning in October, Tarleton passes by the farm of Elizabeth Sewall Whiting. She was a young widow of Colonel Thomas Whiting, and she took note of Tarleton passing by. You can't imagine living in Gloucester at the time and raids are being conducted on your farms. That's your livelihood. A lot of times with the men fighting, the women would be running these farms. It's a lot of responsibility. So she definitely took notice of Tarleton. Later on, the Duc de Lauzon passes by with his soldiers, asking if she's seen any British people that way. Elizabeth takes the opportunity. She informs him that Tarleton had just been by and he was anxious to shake hands with the French Duke. Due to her directions, the opposing forces would meet on October 3rd, 1781, and engage in the largest cavalry battle of the American Revolution. Tarleton would be knocked from his horse, and the Franco-American victory destroyed any hopes of British escape or supply by Gloucester. This hastened the siege of Yorktown and the surrender at Yorktown in September 1781. The United States would finally gain their official independence, and Elizabeth Sewall Whiting and her farm played no small part in that. Go forward about 100 or so years, 200 years, to another large conflict in American history, which was World War I and the Spanish flu. In 1917, the United States joined the Allied forces in World War I. This war was unprecedented in technology, warfare. It was known as the Great War and the War to End All Wars, in hopes that after such a brutal war, the world would instead choose to pursue peace. Changed a lot of technologies, laws, and international boundaries. While the war was waged in Europe and the Pacific, which was referred to as over there by the Americans, over here, the United States was offering support through troops who would train in the U.S. and they would ship over to Europe to fight. Soldiers were important, but nurses were also definitely needed in this battle, in this war. Trained nurses could either serve with the Red Cross or in the military directly. In this time period, though, nurses who were in the military were not afforded military rank. We'll see this kind of repeat a little bit in women's military history. Nurses would have to face amputations, wound dressings, and with new technology, chemical warfare, such as healing patients who had been gassed. There was another deadly illness they would need to treat that was not limited to the war, and that was influenza, H1N1A, or the Spanish flu. So the first confirmed case of Spanish flu is traced to an army camp in Kansas, but it was likely around in Europe long before. Different nations had different names for the disease, such as American flu, which was quickly changed. The French initially called it American flu, and then once we became allies, they switched it. Spanish lady, Flanders flu, and the Japanese called it sumo flu because some sumo wrestlers had gone to Taiwan and caught it there. The flu began with symptoms of headaches and fever. but it was dangerous because it developed very easily into bacterial pneumonia, which was often fatal. This strain was also unusual because it attacked those in their 20s and 30s who were otherwise very healthy, which is pretty unusual for a flu of this sort. The second wave of the disease in 1918 hit the world in about 4 months. People were encouraged to avoid spitting in the street. You see a lot of posters from that era that say don't spit. At this time, treatments for the disease were not available, and there was no cure. Around 50 million people would die from the Spanish flu. It killed more people than the war, and it was one of the most brutal pandemics in history. Cornelia Elizabeth Thornton would be the first American nurse to be buried on English soil during World War I, losing her life in service to her country. She was born in Achilles in 1893. She also went by Nellie, and she graduated from Achilles and gained her nursing degree in Baltimore in 1917. That was the same year that the U.S. entered World War I. She may have entered out of patriotism with the entry of the U.S. into the war, or a desire to heal, or both. She served first in Base Hospital 58. Base Hospital 58 was first established in Illinois, but it moved around where it was needed, and it was noted for being specially geared to patients with respiratory illnesses. Nurses serving the Army Nurse Corps, which is what she served in, were given a strict physical, and they were selected as individuals. The Army Nurse Corps actually grew 3,000% since the pre-war, which is an unbelievable amount of people to me. Nursing overseas was voluntary, and Nellie accepted that and traveled by sea to England in 1918. On the voyage to England, Nellie came down with influenza, which developed into the bacterial pneumonia. In September, in England, Nellie passed away and was buried in England with full military honors to which an Army officer is entitled. In 1920, she was reburied at Arlington National Cemetery. Cornelia Thornton would be one of the first American nurses to die in the war after the joining of the U.S. In 1919, they were building a new ferry boat, a pre-Coleman Bridge. So, a lot of Gloucester residents wanted the boat to be named after Cornelia. It was considered, but it was instead named the Cornwallis because they figured that more people from around the country would know who Cornwallis was than Cornelia Thornton. People were not happy about that. There was one man who said, "I'm surprised at them wanting to honor an Englishman who surrendered instead of an American, giving the honor to him instead." So while the boat was not named after her, in 1921 her portrait was hung in the county courthouse in her honor. The war to end all wars was not the last, unfortunately. In December 1941, a little while after, the United States would join the Second World War after being attacked at Pearl Harbor. This war, a lot more men were away on service than in World War I. So women began to take on jobs that were needed on the home front. I love all these posters. I went down such a rabbit hole looking at all the women's posters from World War II. Women in the United States were very patriotic, and they could support soldiers by volunteering their time, buying war bonds to raise funds, rationing, that was a really big thing you could do to do your part, or working in a factory or other open positions that were needed to keep the country running. Like in the First World War, a lot of women also served as nurses, but since that era, a lot of women had gained new skills in society. There were women with new talents that could be used in the military, and one of those talents was flying. The Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, were formed in 1942. They were a combination of two earlier groups designed to train female pilots and to ferry aircraft to sites so that men could be serving overseas. As the combined WASPs, these female pilots were trained and honed their skills to ferry planes, people, and important items to destinations. They also test flew aircraft, which I thought was kind of interesting. It was said that they were capable of flying any type of aircraft given to them, and they also would fly planes for aerial target practice. So these ladies kind of did it all. I'd be a little nervous to do that. But because there was so much important work to be done, women in the WASPs needed to meet a strict requirement of flight time, pilot's license, and age and height requirements. I believe you had to be over 25 and under 35. It was like a very strict age range. Several African American women applied but were not accepted. But there were still some varied backgrounds in the WASPs. There were a few Chinese women, a couple Latina pilots, and an Oglala Sioux woman who all served. WASP pilots studied the same courses as men in the Army Air Corps, and they spent long, hot days on the tarmac at Sweetwater, Texas, which is where they would train. It was a very driven group of pilots who wanted to serve their country, and one of these women was Margaret Ann Tunner. She's on the big mural. You might recognize her from that. I love that picture. So Margaret Ann Tunner was actually born in Oklahoma in 1917, and everything I've read about her talks about her first flight. It was a $3 airplane ride. That was probably a big expense back in the day. She hated it. It was a very bumpy ride. She was not a fan of flying, very jittery. She actually became interested in flying when she was a little older, when she was in college. She had a friend who knew her interest in aviation and suggested that she take classes at Tulsa University's civilian pilot training program. When the cost to rent an airplane for practice was too high, I believe it was $1 an hour, Margaret and a classmate actually pooled their money and bought their own plane to practice in. So, very devoted to flying. After gaining her license, Margaret flew using the only navigation that was available to her at the time, and that was road maps. So she would use those up in the air to get to her destination. One day, Margaret was reading a magazine and discovered the Women's Flying Training Detachment, which was one of those that was combined into the WASPs. And she actually flew to the site to apply and was accepted into their second class. In 1943, a year later, she would graduate from the second class of the WASP training and begin to serve her country. Getting in was not the easy part. It was very difficult for WASP pilots. Though they worked for the military, they were not really considered part of it, just like the nurses in World War I. WASPs who lost their lives were actually sent home at their family's expense, not the military's expense, and they did not receive any military honors or benefits. Until the WASPs were disbanded in '44, Margaret spent the war ferrying planes across the country wherever they was needed, and also served as a co-pilot and a squadron officer. She said that if a plane was needed in the West Coast, it would always be on the East Coast, so she had some very long flight times. In 1948, when the war was over, she moved to occupied Japan to work as a civil servant. And there, she entered a relationship with Lieutenant General William H. Tunner, who was actually a co-founder of the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which she had enlisted in earlier. He was also the man behind the organization of the Berlin Airlift, so he was a very, very important person, but so was she. And the two would marry in 1951 and testified in 1977 before Congress to recognize the WASPs having military status. It was granted, and in 2009 the WASPs were also granted the Congressional Gold Medal. In 1958, after retiring, Margaret and William moved to Gloucester County with their daughter Suzanne. The Tunners were members of the community, and Margaret continued to fly into the 1990s. When I think of her life here in retirement, I think of a section from a video from 1943 about the WASPs for the Army-Navy Screen magazine, which closed with the statement, "Someday you'll be able to sit down in the evening with your husbands, probably flyers, and remind them that during the war you did your part." I also want to point out the little gremlin in the corner there. Her name is Fifinella. She was designed by Walt Disney, and she was the mascot of the WASPs. I love her. I think she's so fun. Influential women in Gloucester County. So we're going to start with some women's suffrage. Since the beginning of the pursuit of liberty in the United States, women have been questioning why they didn't have the right to vote. There were a lot of Virginia women, even in colonial times, who would write about needing the same rights as men. Gender parity was not unknown in the early Americas. There were a lot of native nations, like the Iroquois and Seneca people, who lived in societies where women were given the right to participate in government. A lot of colonial women saw that and thought, what a great idea. So the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 is in the same area as those Seneca people. Women have been pursuing the right to vote for years, but we typically probably think of suffragettes from the early 1900s when we think about gaining the right to vote. That Seneca Falls Convention began to organize women around the pursuit of equal rights. These rights began with owning property and pursuing career opportunities, but towards the end of the 1800s, a focus on voting became a key focus. took a lot of different efforts to pursue this right, such as protests, lobbying, and notably hunger strikes was also another key. In 1909, the Virginia Equal Suffrage League was founded in Richmond. This group focused on education by doing speeches, letters, and just generally making the public aware of their claims. In Virginia, like most of the South, women's suffrage groups needed to first appeal to the culture before they could get down to the brass tacks of asking for the equal rights. The culture at the time did not encourage a spirit of independence in a woman, feeling that it was unfeminine and wrong. A lot of women in Virginia were arrested for protesting. In 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote in 1920. Virginia did not ratify this with everyone else. Virginia actually finally ratified that amendment in 1952, so it took a long time. I love this poster here. This is from Virginia, the open air speaking for women's rights. Put Virginia back on the map. Do you believe taxation without representation is tyranny? Do you believe women are people? Are you a just man? I like the appeal to the men in the audience as well. Splendid speaker. So it was very active in Virginia. So Sally Nelson Robbins is our suffragette from Gloucester we're going to focus on today. She was one who definitely fostered a spirit of independence in her life. She was a descendant of founding father Thomas Nelson, with the sirens. She was a descendant of Thomas Nelson, but she wanted to make her own mark on history and not rely on that. Sally married William Todd Robbins, who was a widowed former Confederate colonel. He was about 20 years her senior. Not unusual for the time. And in the 1890s, the family moved to Richmond. After the move, Sally Nelson Robbins became very active in everything. I cannot limit it to anything. She published a history of Gloucester County and began working as a historian, which was her passion, with several organizations. She never met an office she didn't like. She served office in the Richmond Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Colonial Dames, and what would eventually become Preservation Virginia. So she was involved in a lot, and one of these causes was also women's suffrage. She served as vice president of the Richmond chapter of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, and she formed a delegation that marched to the governor's mansion in 1915 to lobby for adding women's suffrage to the Virginia Constitution. She also wrote for Virginia Suffrage News. Never met a writing gig she didn't like either. To the governor's mansion gathering, the governor actually said, "This is by far the most attractive delegation that has waited on me since I've been governor." Attractiveness notwithstanding, it was not passed in the legislation. After the death of her husband in the early 1900s, Robbins began to write fiction. She published several books such as Love Stories of Famous Virginians, which was very popular, and Scuffles, which has a very interesting title. But Scuffles was kind of a semi-autobiographical novel of a patrician Virginia woman whose wealthy husband dies in a hunting accident. They all have to move to, not England, whoa. They moved to Richmond with two of her servants and her children to run a boarding house and make their way. Scuffles, I thought, it's written in the early 1900s. I thought the ending was pretty notable. I did read the whole thing. The ending was pretty notable because at the 11th hour, a rich man proposes marriage to the main character. And she actually doesn't accept it immediately. It's kind of left open-ended. At the end of the book, she says she might marry him, but she might not because scufflers always find a way to live. So you can tell she definitely has some very, very feminist leanings about women's empowerment. Daffodils, I know we got the Daffodil Festival coming up, so I wanted to mention those real quick because a woman was kind of behind that. So driving around Gloucester County, there's so much Gloucester history in the form of daffodils dotting the county. They were first brought to the area by English colonists in the 1600s. A lot of people say that the women sewed the bulbs into their skirts to bring them across the Atlantic. The soil and the climate here was really helpful, and Gloucester became covered in daffodils by the 1900s. They were growing wild across Virginia. They were growing wild in the woods. They were everywhere. And Gloucester was definitely becoming identified with the flowers. But becoming the daffodil capital of the world took encouragement from one woman, Eleanor Linthicum Smith of Toddsbury, which is a historic home on the North River. She discovered the financial benefit of daffodils. So probably living on a home on the river, she took note of the water. In the late 1800s, early 1900s in Gloucester, probably the bulk of travel was being done by water, by the steamship lines. And I think she probably took note of that. So she took advantage of two of Gloucester's natural resources, daffodils and water, and led Gloucester on that path to becoming daffodil capital of the world. She paid local children 10 cents per 100 flowers picked, which was a lot more back then, and really fueled a local industry. In the 1920s, Gloucester became a key player in the flower industry. At one point, they shipped up to 120,000 daffodils a day. When an embargo was placed on Dutch daffodil bulbs due to a bug infestation, Gloucester kind of rose to the challenge. So as we go to celebrate the Daffodil Festival soon, we can also celebrate Eleanor Linthicum Smith for bringing that industry to Gloucester County. Moving into the 1900s now. Talk a little bit about civil rights. Gloucester has a very rich civil rights history. It was hard to just pick 3 women for this. So initially I'd like to talk about early African American educators in Gloucester County, or from Gloucester County. With the end of the Civil War, the promise of equal rights was definitely there because large-scale black education in the South had been hindered intentionally for generations. Education was not encouraged under the slavery system. Initially, it was encouraged a little bit as a church-focused education so that those who were enslaved could learn to read the Bible and participate in church. But by 1819 in Virginia, a law was passed prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read or write in schools at day or night, so that really cuts down your options. Emancipation and Reconstruction after the Civil War represented the beginning of these dreams of education, but there were a lot of struggles yet to come. I thought this was interesting. This map here is a map of illiteracy rates in the United States, and we can see this is from the early 1800s, and we can see that the slave states are almost completely illiterate. You know, there was a very big gulf between the wealthy, educated, and the poor and the enslaved in the South. And we can see that this region of Virginia is particularly represented heavily in the illiteracy map. We also have several black schools here, including one where the girls are learning to iron and do housekeeping, but also some larger schools. I believe that one was in Richmond. So despite these struggles, black education still persisted, particularly in Virginia. Several black universities were established across the United States. Hampton University was a heavy hitter. It was established in 1868, founded to educate freedmen and educated alumni such as T.C. Walker, Robert Russo-Moton, and Booker T. Washington. Another, Tuskegee Institute, was founded in Alabama in 1881. I'm sure you've heard of that, the Tuskegee Airmen. It's a national historical site, and it's home to a rich history of black success. Tuskegee was also home to a lot of Hampton University grads. Robert Russo-Moton and Booker T. Washington were involved with Tuskegee, as well as someone else, Jenny Booth Moton. I love that hat. So Jenny Booth Moton was born in 1880, one of 12 children to a farming and oystering family. At 17, she enrolled in Hampton University, where she would teach after graduating. And while she was teaching, she met a man named Robert Russo-Moton. He was a widower and a prominent educator in Virginia. They married in 1908, and they would both work tirelessly for the advancement of education and African American opportunities. So when the founder of Tuskegee, personal mentor to Moton, Booker T. Washington, passed away in 1915, Robert Russo-Moton took his place as the second president of Tuskegee Institute. Robert Russo-Moton would publish several books on history and race relations. He inspected black troops in World War I and was appointed by Herbert Hoover to lead the Colored Advisory Commission, which looked into damages to the black community during the Mississippi flood in the 1920s. After retirement, the Motons would move back to Virginia to Holly Knoll in Gloucester, which became a hub for civil rights discussions. He was not the only one in his marriage to fight for civil rights, though. Jenny Booth was active in community service. She served as president of the Tuskegee Women's Club. It's a long list. Alabama Association of Women's Clubs, National Association of Colored Women, and directed the Department of Women's Industries. She also served on the executive board of the Southern Interracial Committee in the 1920s. Jenny Booth was from a multiracial family. Booth was also influenced by her upbringing in that farming family. She did a lot of work for agricultural work and for farmers. She was involved in the betterment of opportunities for black farmers, working for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration as a field agent. So she traveled the South to speak with black farmers and women and get their perspective for the government agency. She did more than that. She was accomplishing a lot. So in 1941, with Mary McLeod Bethune and A. Philip Randolph, would influence Roosevelt to pass Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in the defense industries, which came just in time for World War II. So far from just the wife of the accomplished president, Jenny Booth worked alongside and independently of her husband to further opportunities for all Americans. Coming up a little bit after this, we have the Jim Crow South and travel, which has a monumental case that was actually begun in Gloucester. After the era of Reconstruction, an attempt to maintain the white superiority in government, a series of laws commonly known as Jim Crow laws began to encompass the South. By the early 1900s, they were pervasive. There were a lot of civil rights gained right after the Civil War and Reconstruction, but a lot of these were repealed during the Jim Crow era. These laws segregated schools, buses, and jobs to enforce that separated system. Even drinking fountains were segregated, so every little detail of life would be touched by Jim Crow. And travel was a huge issue. So in 1890, Louisiana passed legislation to segregate train cars. Individuals such as Homer A. Plessy, who was a multiracial French Creole man, tested the system by sitting in the white section and was arrested. This resulted in the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, where the United States government upheld that separate but equal was constitutional. And travel was not only segregated, it could also be very dangerous. These books, like the one I have here, the Green Book, these were a series of books published from the 1930s up to the 1960s for and by African Americans. These books detailed sites in states across the United States and Mexico and Canada, and some later editions that were friendly to black visitors. So it has like beauty shops, places to stay, hotels, restaurants, places that you knew you could go and get service and be safe, that it was guaranteed. This article here I actually thought was kind of interesting, and it kind of highlights a lot of kind of the ridiculousness of some of these Jim Crow laws, because there was a man who was traveling in the U.S. South, a black man, and he put on a turban and he said a Swedish accent and pretended to be a foreign dignitary so he could receive service in white restaurants, and it worked. In a lot of restaurants. There was an Alabama restaurant in this article, which I just thought this was crazy. He asked a waiter while he was eating, well, what would happen if a black man came to dine here? And the waiter said, well, no black man would ever dare to eat in this establishment. And he said, I stroked my chin and ordered my dessert. So, I mean, it really highlights how bizarre these laws really were. So, in this environment, 11 years before Rosa Parks' case, a woman named Irene Morgan would take her stand when traveling from Gloucester, Virginia. I love this picture of her with the dog. I think it's wonderful. So Irene Morgan was born into a Seventh-day Adventist Tidewater family in Baltimore, Maryland in 1917. By the 1940s, World War II had arrived, and Irene Morgan was living in Baltimore with her 2 children and her husband. She was doing her part on the home front. She worked at Glen L. Martin, where she worked on aircraft such as the B-26 Marauder. This is an aircraft that saw action in the European and the Pacific theaters. In 1944, Irene was struck by deep tragedy in her family. She suffered a miscarriage. And after she'd healed a little bit, Irene traveled to Gloucester to spend time with her family and emotionally and physically recover. After her visit, she planned to leave her 2 children with family at Hayes Store for a couple weeks so she could go back to see her husband in Baltimore, and she needed to pass a medical clearance again to work on the aircraft again. So she took a Greyhound bus from Hayes Store and began her journey back to Baltimore. Virginia had legislation requiring segregation on interstate bus travel. So when the bus stopped in Saluda, it was a very hot July day, a white couple boarded. And African Americans could not only not sit near white people on the same seat, They could also not sit across from them on a seat. So when this white couple boarded, the driver told her she needed to move seats to the back. Her seatmate moved, but Irene refused. She did say initially she wasn't sure if they were serious because it was an interstate bus. The driver left the bus and returned with a sheriff and an arrest warrant. Irene was not going down without a fight. She tore up the warrant and threw it out the window, telling the officer that he didn't even know her name. And then she engaged in a physical struggle with the sheriff when he tried to pull her from her seat. She said she kicked him in a very bad place. He howled off, and then another officer came on board and told her he would use his nightstick against her, to which she shot back, well, then we'll whip each other. Irene was arrested, charged with resisting arrest, and she knew it was wrong. When her mother came to pick her up and pay her bail, she said, "They had not seen the last of me." So with the support of the NAACP, she took her case to some local courts, or it didn't hold up. Then it was taken to the U.S. Supreme Court, who ruled that segregation on interstate bus travel was unconstitutional, not on the grounds of discrimination, but on the grounds of complicating travel between states. But she still won her case. On taking her case to the court, Morgan stated, "If something happens to you that is wrong, the best thing to do is have it corrected in the best way you can, and taking it to the Supreme Court was the best way I could." Her bravery set the stage for further civil rights cases, such as the case brought by Rosa Parks. In 2001, she was given the Presidential Citizens Medal by Bill Clinton. Yes, I do have that picture in here. She lived out the end of her life in Gloucester County as well with her daughter. During the Freedom Riders summer, the Freedom Riders actually sang a song in which the lyrics were, "On June 3rd, the High Court said, when you ride interstate, Jim Crow is dead. Get on the bus, sit any place, because Irene Morgan won her case. You don't have to ride Jim Crow." So moving from interstate travel, segregation in the South was still pervasive, and education was not an exception to that. Plessy versus Ferguson, which we talked about earlier, established the legality of separate but equal as lawful, but many schools were separate but not equal. There were subpar buildings and supplies often compared to the white schools. I actually know a man from Gloucester who said that realizing the difference between the food served at different schools is what made him realize that separate but equal was not, in fact, true. While Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional, there was still a long way to go for equality in education. Children integrating schools faced the threat of violence and threats. In 1956, Virginia specifically adopted a policy called massive resistance to prevent integration of the school system. Laws were passed to shut down any school that integrated. In a lot of areas of Virginia, to circumvent ordered integration by the federal government, private schools would open that were conveniently white only. This was helped by private education tuition grants that were funded for Virginia. Some areas took this to intense extremes. In Prince Edward County, when ordered in 1959 to integrate, the county shut down the entire public school system. Black students were sent to stay with family outside of the county or even outside of the state to get an education. In 1964, the federal government, due to cases like this, outlawed the private education tuition grants, which brought an end to massive resistance and opened Virginia up to integration. Gloucester's high school fully integrated in the late 1960s, and one of the women who integrated the school was named Rosette Tabb. She did it all, I'm sure you can tell from these pictures. Rosette Tabb was born in 1954 in Gloucester, Virginia. Gloucester High School integrated in phases. It was fully integrated after the end of massive resistance in Virginia. Rosette Tabb was one of the students in one of the first fully integrated classes to graduate. Integration at Gloucester High did not have the presence of white protesters shouting down children like Ruby Bridges and Little Rock 9, what we think of. But it still wasn't as simple as just showing up and being immediately accepted. There were still social barriers that were active. Sometimes there were slurs and fights taking place. I read an article that a lot of black students had a hard time when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated because they felt that the other children at school didn't understand how much that meant to them. Some of the first students to integrate chose to do so, leaving the tight-knit community of T.C. Walker for Gloucester High until it fully integrated. So Rosette Tabb, pictured here, she did more than just attend school. She really excelled. She became one of the school's first black cheerleaders. Even the cheerleaders had a little bit of struggle integrating. Fellow black cheerleader Faye Thomas Lemon stated that once they had a cheer that referenced slavery, and she felt that she had to go along and cheer anyway. Beyond cheerleading, Rosette Tabb also broke barriers as the school's first black homecoming queen, pictured up here, and as president of Gloucester's student government. After high school, Rosette began a career in the CIA. She also studied business administration from George Mason and worked in travel and as a notary. She was very active in her church and in missions. Rosette became vice president of Women in Service Everywhere, serving in several countries such as Liberia, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, and South Africa. In this work, she tackled food insecurity, human trafficking, and women's rights. So in her life, Rosette Tabb proved to excel not only by breaking barriers, but also focusing so much on human kindness and trying to kind of pay it forward for others. And those are our 9 notable Gloucester women. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your time. I'll take any questions if anyone has any. No pressure.
I have a question.
Yes.
So there was so much information in this, and so not.
I know.
So my question is, how much time did you have to spend to research to create this presentation? Because I know that you work at the museum and you study this in school for so long. So I'm just curious, kind of what was put together now versus what can people just stop by the museum and talk to one of our museum staff and kind of learn the same stories if they weren't able to make it today?
Yeah, so it took me about 3 weeks to get all of this down. That included finding images. That took a lot of time. I tried to get that done first. So it does take a while to dive into these things. A lot of times I'll find information that's contradicting. Like with Nellie Thornton, her grave says she was born in Maryland, but she was born in Achilles. She studied in Maryland. So sometimes when you're looking into something like this, you have to fact check everything by finding like 3 different sources. Jenny Booth Moten, it said she was born in Rowan, but then someone else said she was born in Goochland, so you have to really kind of, that was the bulk of the work, was fact checking everything. But yeah, if you come by the Gloucester County Museum, we do still have a lot of things related to this that you can read. So we have a wonderful exhibit on Gloucester A&I, which was a private black school in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And we're actually renovating our upstairs exhibits. And so a lot of this information is going to be in that exhibit when we update it. We're going to have a wall of notable Gloucester folks, and then some of these will be featured throughout that exhibit in different sections as well. So I hope that answered it. All right. No pressure. You don't have to come up with any questions.
I have another question.
You do? Okay.
When you mentioned about flying, that there was a very narrow age range, but they also had to pass a height requirement. I was wondering if you came across what that was.
I think it was just for the types of aircraft they were flying,
Okay.
that you weren't going to have to like struggle to fit in. They had a lot of applicants, so they could kind of afford to be very specific and that sort of thing. I think I want to say it was a 50% graduation rate from the WASP training school, so they did have a lot of people apply. So it was kind of the cream of the crop. So they could afford to set those age and height restrictions a little bit more. There's a great video on the internet that was where I got the quote from, that was shot for the Army and the Navy, that was talking about these women who were flying. You know, it's about 5 minutes long, but it really goes into all the requirements they had. And I mean, training was pretty intense, and they did the same training that the men did, which is why they wanted to fight to get that recognition as military status, you know, since they were doing the same work. All right. Yes?
I was just wondering what the ferry, if it was a ferry that T.C. Walker took to get over to Hampton University, what it's called now.
Yeah.
And, you know, he had to pay to get on there, and he had spent.
Yeah, I
the
know.
money. I noticed when the ferries, there were 2 different kinds of ferries up here.
Yeah, so I don't recall which one he took. I'm not sure if it was, I mean, he had to get across to Yorktown, so I'm sure he took that ferry, and I don't remember if he had to take something else to get to Hampton, because I know he arrived by water in Hampton as well. And I also know that with food and the fee for the ferry, he was out of money by the time he went to Hampton University. He couldn't pay for the classes. So what they actually did is they allowed him and several other, because it will go back to Gloucester, and they said, we're not going back to Gloucester, you know. And he said that he was actually surprised he even said that, because he was pretty obedient, you know. But they said, well, we're not going back. And so the school had organized it that they could instead work to pay for school during the day, and at night they would take their classes. So that he was part of the first class that did that, all because he ran out of money on the ferry. So pretty interesting.
Really,
Now Hampton history has a great legacy, and so many students who grad. Wanda Sykes, I think, even went to Hampton University. I found that when I was researching. I didn't include her because she's not from Gloucester, but I wanted to. But yeah, a really, really rich history there. And then with T.C. Walker being from Gloucester, you know, we have a little bit of that legacy here as well.
Right. And then Booker T. walking to Hampton to go there.
From like Western Virginia, yeah, unbelievable. I read about him a little bit too when I was researching Miss Moten, because the three of them were very close. You know, he mentored the both of them. Yeah, walking from West Virginia to Hampton is it's hard for me to imagine, but it just shows how important that education was to people to get that you'd be willing to do anything for it.
So the Motens, that was one of the things I wanted to study, so you covered that for me.
Okay.
Because there's a school in Hampton, I taught in Hampton, there's a school that's Moten Elementary.
Oh yeah, I did come across that too. And that has a pretty rich history too. That actually came up a lot when I was studying.
His wife was amazing.
She really was.
Yeah.
You know, because I wanted someone connected. You know, I believe she was from Gloucester originally, as well. So it was probably maybe I don't know if she suggested they move to Hollyknoll. You know, I don't know what that conversation was. But to accomplish so much, you know, it was really kind of a power couple a little bit. You know,
Yes,
because
exactly.
they were both doing so much, and then her work as a field agent really interested me. Because I expected to see not just, but mostly a focus on education, but seeing her work for government agencies as well, and helping pass that bill against discrimination or the executive order against discrimination. That was really impressive.
Definitely.
So we have all the murals up and down Main Street, and I have to admit that I haven't spent much time looking at them, but you brought it up in one part. Can you talk about, I know that you mentioned that the pilot is on the mural. Are any of the other women in your presentation today on the mural down at the new co-op building?
Yes, I'm trying to remember who specifically, but I do know multiple women are. I know Irene Morgan for a fact is on the mural as well. And we actually have another pilot on there that I didn't have time to mention, but Mary Shipko, who lives in Gloucester, she was one of the first female commercial airline pilots. She flew for Hughes Air West, so she's up there too. So we have two pilots, which is kind of cool. And then Irene Morgan. I don't know if Sally Nelson Robbins is on there, but Judith Lomax, a poet from the early 1800s, is on there. So we have another writer there. And a couple artists, but those are the only people I can think of off the top of my head. The mural is really fantastic too, though. It's a great way to honor the women's history in Gloucester County, because obviously we have a lot of women's history in Gloucester County. I kind of found more than I was expecting to. It was hard to cut it down to about nine ladies for the presentation. All right, we're all out of questions. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thank
Sidney.
Thank you.